On March 1943, the heat of the Pacific War hung heavy over the American airstrips scattered across the Solomon Islands. The sun rose early each morning, lighting the long rows of metal-skinned aircraft resting on rough dirt runways. Pilots started their day with dust in their boots, engines warming in the background, and the constant reminder that Japanese fighters still controlled large parts of the sky. The P-38 Lightning had already become a key American aircraft in the region, famous for its twin engines and unusual shape, but it also carried a problem that pilots had learned to respect. It struggled in tight dogfights against the Japanese A-6M-0. The Zero was lighter, turned faster, and could roll tighter at slow speeds. Pilots flying the P-38 had to rely on diving speed, teamwork, and ambush tactics. But the war did not always offer such perfect conditions. Many fights became chaotic, and pilots found themselves forced into turning battles they did not want. Reports from the front kept mentioning the same difficulty. The P-38 was strong and deadly in a straight line, but whenever the fight slowed down, it felt stiff and heavy. And the consequence of losing a turning fight with a Zero was usually fatal. On this same airstrip worked Corporal Harry C. Raines, a 23-year-old mechanic from California. He had joined the Army Air Forces not as a pilot, but as a man who understood machines better than he understood people. Raines had grown up repairing cars in the family garage, often tearing engines apart just to see how they worked. He had a quiet nature, a habit of speaking only when necessary, and a determination to solve problems even when they were considered unsolvable. His hands were usually covered in grease, and his uniform carried the marks of long nights spent working under lantern light. Raines had listened to pilots talk every day. He heard their complaints, their doubts, their fears, and their questions. He watched them return from missions with bullet holes in their wings and oil leaking from engine housings. Whenever pilots gathered near the mess tent, conversations always circled back to the same subject: the Zero. One pilot described how he had tried to hold a turn with a Japanese fighter, but felt his P-38 resist him like it was fighting its own wings. Another mentioned that during tight maneuvers, the control surfaces stiffened so much that he felt almost locked out of steering. These were not small problems. These were survival problems. If a Lightning could not respond fast enough, it meant the pilot might not come home. Raines listened quietly, noticing how pilots used the same words again and again: stiff, slow, heavy, lagging. He started thinking about what inside the aircraft created those limitations. Every aircraft had aerodynamic limits, but Raines believed some mechanical restrictions could be adjusted. His mind worked constantly, even when he was tightening bolts or checking hydraulic lines, looking for small details that controlled how the aircraft behaved during extreme movement. One evening, after a long day of maintenance, Raines stayed behind as most of the crew walked back to camp. The hangar lights glowed faintly on the silver skin of a grounded P-38. He studied the control system inside the wing, tracing the path of cables and rods that connected the pilot's stick to the ailerons and elevators. He noticed something small that most people would not have considered important: a factory-installed safety wire locking part of the trim system into one position. The wire prevented the aircraft from using the full range of a stabilizer adjustment that could change how the P-38 handled at lower speeds. It was a simple thing, something added at the factory for safety during high-speed dives, but Raines wondered if, under combat conditions, that same restriction was limiting the plane's ability to turn sharply at medium or low speed. The P-38 had dive flaps and control locks to protect pilots from the dangerous phenomenon of compressibility. However, Raines realized that a mechanic who understood the machine deeply could adjust these elements without compromising safety if he applied careful judgment.
The next morning, before the sun fully rose, Raines took his idea to a test. He carefully removed the locking wire, adjusted the tension on the trim system, and placed a small metal brace that allowed the stabilizer to shift at a slightly different angle during tight turns. He double-checked every bolt and made sure nothing interfered with the aircraft's safety. It was not a factory design. It was a field adjustment made by a man who knew the aircraft by feel, sound, and behavior. When the pilot assigned to that P-38 Lieutenant James Kirkland, arrived for inspection, Rains explained the change. Kirkland listened, but raised his eyebrows. The idea sounded odd, something that might work or might not. But he trusted Rains. He had flown missions in aircraft maintained by the same hands and survived because of them. So he agreed to test it. Later that morning, Kirkland got into the cockpit and taxied toward the runway. The engines roared with their usual twin thunder as the P-38 lifted into the sky. Rains stood below, watching the sunlight flash across the spinning propellers. The test flight began with simple movements. Kirkland tried turns at medium altitude, then sharper turns, then rapid roll changes. Rains waited for the moment when the pilot's reaction would show whether the idea had worked. When Kirkland landed, dust kicking up behind the wheels, he pulled off his helmet and walked straight toward Rains with a stunned look. His first words were simple: "Whatever you did, don't undo it." According to Kirkland, the aircraft felt different. It responded faster, held tighter turns, and no longer fought the pilot the same way. For the first time, a P-38 on that airstrip felt like it could challenge a Zero in slow maneuvering. It was not that the airplane had suddenly become lighter. It was that the pilot now had more authority over it, more control during high-pressure maneuvers, and more flexibility to improvise in combat. Rains did not announce what he had done. He did not speak loudly or try to earn credit. He simply returned to the hangar and applied the same adjustment to the next aircraft, and then the next. By the end of the week, several P-38s in the squadron carried the modification. The pilots noticed, even if they did not fully understand why. They talked about how their Lightnings now turned more sharply, climbed more responsively, and handled emergency maneuvers with smoother control. Word spread quietly through the unit. The true test came only days later. On an afternoon mission, a group of P-38s escorting bombers encountered a formation of Japanese Zeros approaching from the east. The air was clear, visibility wide, and the sunlight glinted off the surfaces of both American and Japanese planes as they closed the distance. The Zeros began their usual tactic: slow the fight, force the Americans into horizontal turns, and outmaneuver them with agility. But the fight unfolded differently this time. A Zero cut across the formation, attempting to drag a P-38 into a tight circle. The American pilot followed, expecting the familiar stiffness of his controls. Instead, the aircraft banked smoothly and held a tighter arc than he had ever managed before. The Zero overshot slightly, surprised at the sudden angle of the P-38. The American pilot fired a burst that clipped the tail of the Japanese fighter, sending it falling away. On another part of the sky, a P-38 dove sharply to chase a pair of Zeros, then pulled up aggressively into a climbing turn. Instead of losing responsiveness halfway through the climb, the aircraft maintained its line. The Japanese fighters tried to follow, but the Lightning gained altitude too quickly, swinging behind one of the Zeros and taking it down in a short burst. Pilots returned from the mission excited, speaking with a different tone than usual. They talked about how the P-38s had maneuvered with a kind of confidence, how they no longer felt handicapped in a slow-speed battle, and how for the first time they had surprised Japanese pilots who previously relied on their dominance in turning fights. The squadron commanders noticed the improvement in performance immediately, though the exact reason was not widely known.
Rains continued working quietly, rarely mentioning the change he had developed. He thought of it not as a discovery, but as a necessary adaptation to the demands of war. He believed that if something helped pilots survive, then it was worth doing, even if no one remembered who came up with it. As weeks passed, reports from the field began to show a small shift. P-38 units in this region reported improved dogfight outcomes. Pilots began using more aggressive tactics, combining the aircraft's natural strengths, speed, diving power, long-range endurance, with the improved maneuverability introduced by Rains's adjustment. The results were noticeable, not just to the Americans, but to Japanese pilots as well. They encountered P-38s that reacted faster, turned harder, and could stay engaged longer in close combat. By late spring, squadron maintenance chiefs began hearing rumors from other airfields about similar adjustments. Mechanics shared knowledge informally, and within months, Rains's idea, first considered a stupid little wire trick, as one pilot jokingly called it,
spread through multiple units. The mechanic himself remained almost invisible in the official history. He continued repairing bullet-riddled aircraft, replacing parts under harsh conditions, and ensuring pilots had functioning machines. When storms rolled over the jungle, or when the airstrip became muddy after sudden rainfall, Rains worked through the night. He knew the next day might demand every aircraft ready for action. One evening, after a long mission had ended and the sound of returning aircraft faded, Rains sat near the wing of a grounded P-38 and watched the sunset. The sky turned orange, then deep red, reflecting off the metal surfaces. Pilots walked by, discussing the day's events, unaware that the quiet mechanic sitting in the shadows had played a part in giving them an advantage. He did not need recognition. His satisfaction came from seeing aircraft return safely, engines cooling, guns empty, but tail numbers intact. Months later, after several hard campaigns, the Japanese air forces in the region began to weaken. The P-38 remained a crucial aircraft, escorting bombers, intercepting enemy formations, and carrying out long-range missions deep into enemy territory. Its improved performance allowed pilots to fight with greater flexibility. In combat reports, some pilots mentioned how their aircraft felt like it had come alive at lower speeds or during tight maneuvers. They wrote about being able to roll faster, hold angles longer, and recover from dives more smoothly. In the broader history of the Pacific Air War, many factors contributed to American success: new tactics, radar development, improved logistics, and better training. But hidden among these large-scale changes were small, precise adjustments made by people who worked far from the spotlight. Rains fit into that group, a mechanic whose understanding of machines allowed him to spot a detail most others missed. His trick did not make the P-38 invincible. It did not erase its natural limitations or remove the dangers pilots faced, but it made the aircraft more adaptable, more responsive, and more competitive in fights where seconds determined life or death. And it showed how sometimes the simplest mechanical insight can influence the outcome of battles fought miles above the ground. Years later, when the war ended and the Pacific quieted, many of the people involved returned home. Pilots carried memories of missions, lost friends, and narrow escapes. Mechanics carried memories of long nights, smoking engines, and the constant responsibility of keeping machines alive. Rains returned to a quieter life, never seeking fame for what he had done. His adjustment, his simple modification, remained mostly in the stories exchanged by pilots who felt the difference in the air. In the documentary record of World War II, the story stands as a quiet reminder that not all heroes sit in the cockpit. Sometimes they stand under the wings, holding tools, working in silence, and making small decisions that ripple far beyond the hangar. And in the history of the P-38 Lightning, the forgotten mechanic's wire trick became one of those hidden contributions that shaped how the aircraft fought, survived, and ultimately dominated skies once ruled by the Zero.